The Russian Revolution changed the world forever. Almost overnight, an entire society was destroyed and replaced with one of the most radical social experiments ever seen. Poverty, crime, privilege and class division were to be eliminated. A new era of socialism promised peace, prosperity and equality for all the peoples of the world. But the social experiment failed. Millions were killed, and within a generation, almost 1/3 of the world's population was living in the shadow of communism. This story shows how an idealistic dream turned into a nightmare, as seen by the sailors at the vanguard of the revolution. Drawn from their letters and accounts, the story is told using archive and reconstructions of the events, all in color, just as they might have seen it. This is the story of the Russian Revolution. Less than 20 miles from St. Petersburg, in the Gulf of Finland, lays a small fortified island. It was built to defend the former capital of Russia against attack from the sea. Surrounded by a string of fortresses, it is still an active naval base, and until a few years ago, the island and its garrison town of Kronstadt remained closed to visitors. Only recently has the story of what happened here in the early years of the revolution been finally pieced together. In February 1917, St. Petersburg was known as Petrograd. The First World War was in its third winter, and the long-suffering people of the city were hungry. Stocks of bread were about to be rationed. The shortages meant many were queuing all night long, sometimes for just part of a loaf, and they were fed up with it. On the 23rd of February, women in the factories came out onto the streets to protest at the lack of bread. When rumors spread that the bread was being deliberately hoarded and held back from them, their mood darkened.
They threw some snowballs at the men's factories to get them out, and when the men came out on the street, it became clear that there was a very significant strike in the capital.
As the men from the factories joined the women, the cries changed from demands for bread to the removal of Russia's emperor, the Tsar. By the end of the afternoon, 100,000 workers were now on strike. Socialist agitators reacted to the demonstrations, and after factory meetings the next morning, workers again marched to the city, armed with spanners and hammers, ready for a fight. Among those watching the events unfold were some of the sailors on leave from the nearby naval base.
At first, we weren't sure what was happening. We talked about whether we should stay or go back to our base in Kronstadt, but to be honest, we didn't really care. Not at first. Raskolnikov was different. He wasn't on leave like the rest of us. He was training to be an officer, but he was also a real revolutionary, a Bolshevik. And as the demonstrations got bigger, he was really keen to find out what was happening. In the end, we all were.
Over the next 2 days, the protests grew louder, larger, and increasingly difficult to control. They could no longer be tolerated.
The response of the authorities was to sweep the demonstrators off the street, and they brought in soldiers to do that. And there was some considerable violence on the 25th of February.
Although many men, women, and children had already been hacked down or shot by the police, demonstrators still crowded the streets. One demonstration was brought to a standstill by a squadron of Cossacks who had been brought in to support the police.
I think the easiest way to grasp it is to think that Russia's been kind of a bottle of fizzy water that's been shaken and shaken and shaken for years. And suddenly in February the top comes off.
The Cossacks were one of the most brutal fighting units in Russia. They had shown no fear of ruthlessly crushing demonstrations in the past and were traditionally loyal to the Tsar. Now followed one of many moments over the next few days that would change the course of history. From this moment, the people called these men Comrade Cossacks, seeing them as merely workers and peasants in uniform. But one of the most fearsome units of the army had proved unreliable. The city authorities would now have to turn for help to Russia's very highest authority. They called on the Tsar to intervene. The Tsar was the supreme ruler of the Russian Empire, but he was away at the front, overseeing his campaign in the war against Germany. But the war was going badly for Russia, and he had little time for what he saw as a protest or two back in Petrograd. He received telegrams pleading with him to take immediate steps about the situation in the capital. At first, he seemed annoyed by the interruption, but by the evening, he could resist the telegrams no longer. He responded in the only way he knew.
In terms of politics, he had absolutely no sense whatsoever. I think you could say that politically he was a complete idiot. He was getting advice from his police chief saying the situation's getting out of hand, we must take action. His instinct always was bring out the machine guns.
The confrontation with the people had escalated to a new level. The slogans on the banners now read, "Freedom or death." By the fourth day of demonstrations, the center of Petrograd had become a battlefield, as fresh army units were brought face to face with the protesters. Now, under the direct orders of the Tsar, they were to shoot the demonstrators if they did not disperse.
Сейчас же стрелять! Я приказываю! Сейчас же стреляйте! Я приказал стрелять! Открыть огонь! Бли! Бли!
"50 people lay dead, but the Tsar had failed to end the protests. Despite the killings, the demonstrations continued.
Вот! Становись!
Back at the barracks, the soldiers were becoming increasingly angry at what had happened. And when their officer tried to force them back onto the streets again, they made their feelings known. One soldier, Sergei Kapitchnikov, said, "Our fathers, mothers, sisters, brothers and brides are begging for bread. Are we going to kill them?" The officer had lost control. Fearing for his life, he made the error of walking away. then worse still, of running. A mutiny had started. Now they knew there was no turning back.
The crucial moment was the point at which they went into a situation of mutiny, and the only way they could preserve themselves or save themselves after that was by the mutiny spreading.
The soldiers moved from barracks to barracks, looking for support, and soon other mutineers were on the streets and joining with the workers. Whilst the streets of the capital were erupting in violence, over 30,000 soldiers and sailors were stationed nearby at Kronstadt. The sailors of Kronstadt were to become a key part of the revolution. These highly feared crack troops were literate and well-trained, as at that time the Navy was at the forefront of technology. But Kronstadt was also a dangerous place. For many years, it had been a seat of deep frustration. Even the base commander, Admiral Viren, had likened the fortress to a gunpowder store.
It's a place where there's very strict discipline, where the sailors are kept under, these are new recruits, kept under fairly tight control by the authorities before February 1917.
Sailors were treated little better than animals and could be severely punished for minor misdemeanors.
If you didn't salute, you could get 10 days detention. There was almost a suppressed war in Kronstadt between the officers and the sailors. Sailors in Kronstadt were just simply sitting in the ships. They'd hardly seen any action during the war. The ships were cauldrons of indiscipline, they were cauldrons of tension. It was just a bomb waiting to explode, essentially.
It was like a nuclear reactor of revolution, all a kind of critical mass of revolt, which sets off revolution at several points in Russia's history.
As the sailors heard more and more stories of what was going on in the capital, their frustration started to erupt again.
Officers, commanders tried to keep this information about Petrograd secret. But it's difficult to keep it secretly. It's close to the city, and sailors, they have also always contacts in staffs and so on. So they got portions of information, and they got rumors, of course, and sometimes rumors exaggerated the situation.
They knew there were riots in the streets. They knew that there was hunger and there were bread riots. But all of a sudden, it looks as though this is something much more than that. And they begin asking the authorities what's happening. They begin meeting. They begin holding illegal meetings of sailors around their ships. The authorities get nervous about what's going on. They begin to lose control.
Some of the sailors were veterans of failed rebellions in the past. They weren't going to make the same mistakes they had made then.
It's very difficult it's impossible to organize revolution. So one historical lessons for these guys at 1917 was A, not to drink, B, to control officers, and maybe it's better just to kill them.
On the 1st of March, the sailors gathered to elect a new revolutionary committee. This is the beginning of a bloody squaring of accounts. The sailors took little time to get their hands on the officers who had treated them harshly.
It all happened so quickly. In the space of one day, we rid ourselves of any officers that stood in the way. If they weren't with us, we killed them. At the top of our list was the man we hated the most. Admiral Viren came out of his house dressed in a white summer tunic. I think he wanted to look important, but he looked pathetic.
He was a very strict commander. They hated him, so they not thought them, I mean rank and file sailors, to be one of us. He was one of them.
As they ripped off his epaulets, they read his sentence. Your barbarous, brutal regime has turned Kronstadt into a prison. Now take your reward.
Господи, спаси Россию от этих уродов.
By the following morning, the officers of Kronstadt have either been executed or killed by the sailors, or they've been imprisoned. The lucky ones have been imprisoned, and the old authority has been destroyed.
As the crisis deepens, the Emperor, Tsar Nicholas II, is stopped on his journey back from the German front. Revolutionaries have closed the line ahead, and he is trapped on the imperial train. The dictatorial ruler now sits powerless in a siding.
The pathetic figure which Nicholas cuts in those last few days, where he can't even command his railway train to get back to Petrograd.
Now it was the turn of the Tsar to listen to others, and as each message arrived, it became clear that he had only one course of action.
All but one of his front commanders sent him telegrams saying, abdicate.
For 300 years, his family had ruled over the Russian Empire. If he abdicated now, it seemed unlikely that anyone else would take over. His brother had already refused the throne, and his son, a haemophiliac, was much too weak and fragile. The Tsar was staring at the end of the Romanov dynasty.
Essentially, the Tsar either had to make some very, very far-reaching concessions or go. And in the end, because there was no heir, no person to take over, Nicholas abdicated and the regime came to a rather ignominious end.
With the Tsar's abdication and arrest, and no one to replace him, the revolution appeared unstoppable. Tsarist symbols were torn down, and the country rushed enthusiastically into uncharted territory.
Immediately after the uprising in March of 1917, you have what's called the honeymoon of the revolution, when it looks as though everything's going to be okay. The forces of the left, and that goes from moderates and liberals to socialists, have joined together. They got rid of the Tsar. Surprisingly, the Tsarist government's collapsed. I mean, everyone is astonished by that. The army hasn't resisted. It looks as though there's been a kind of bloodless revolution.
It is a time of ideas and ideals, and Kronstadt attracted radicals of all colors to come and spread the word.
Barely a day went by without someone coming to tell us how we had changed the world. Of course, they were after our support as much as anything else. But there really was a feeling we had taken control of our own future. I remember one woman, Larissa Reisner, came and talked of poetry and books to set us thinking. It wasn't what some of us were used to, but we quite liked her. Especially Raskolnikov.
За кого агитировать будешь?
Братва, тихо вы дайте человеку сказать!
Людей победить, нам надо быть умнее. Согласны?
Printing presses could barely keep up with all the papers and leaflets proclaiming the dawn of a new era.
People got new faith. It was very religious, this feeling of revolution. They had a feeling of being the center of the world. The most important events are here, and it's up to us how to solve them. So we are masters of history to some extent. Russia was eager to read. Everybody wanted to read. We are free person, and it's interesting about sailors. Some sailors posed with books. It was a new image of sailor citizen, reading, wanting to get knowledge, to be enlightened, to be free citizen of free Russia.
A groundswell of socialism was surging through the country, and the sailors were at the heart of it. The people were in power, and the voice of sailors, soldiers and workers could be heard through a mass of local councils, the Soviets.
The first thing people did was to set up institutions to reflect their values, their interests, and to begin to defend them. The Soviets were set up to represent the masses, and they did that very effectively. Factories set up committees, regiments set them up, battleships set them up. When you think about it, it's really extraordinary. The Russian people all stood up for themselves. It was direct democracy at its best and worst.
Братва, хватит орать, нам надо совет выбрать.
At the naval base at Kronstadt, the revolution had gripped the sailors even more radically than in Petrograd.
Замечательно. Советом рабочих, солдатских, крестьянских депутатов. Все за? Записывай. Почему я должен? Тебя уже выбрали, ты уже председатель.
They, in a sense, almost took out a kind of unilateral Declaration of Independence, a UDI, on Kronstadt.
Kronstadt is very much its own place. They had the most direct form of democracy. They had daily meetings at 12 o'clock in Anchor Square. Anybody who wanted to could join in. Ordinary people are beginning to say, we can run our lives. We don't need bosses to tell us. We don't need officers to tell us. We are perfectly capable of running our own affairs.
The new mini-state of Kronstadt even started to develop its own laws.
There was a lot of criminality in Petrograd. There was no criminality in Kronstadt at summer of 1917, because these sailors, they created practically a terror against the criminal. They thought it to be revolutionary. No criminals, no prostitution, no gambling on the great island of Kronstadt, and they were proud.
Back in Petrograd, it was almost as if the February Revolution had never happened. The Tsar's regime had been replaced by a temporary provisional government. Its ministers were Democrats, but many of them were landowners too, and they were committed to continuing the war with Germany. Exiled revolutionary leaders had different ideas, and they were on their way home. In a sealed train direct from Switzerland came one of the most important of the revolutionaries, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov. His party name was Lenin. This was the man who would take over the Russian Revolution. His arrival would change everything. The people of Russia were looking forward to a future as one of the freest countries in the world. But now Lenin is on his way, determined to seize the revolution and make it his own.
Lenin was somebody who was well known within Russia, seen as an extremely dangerous revolutionary. But at the time, the authorities, the new authorities, the provisional government, felt that the spirit of New Russia, the spirit of democracy, required that they allow Lenin back into Russia.
Lenin brought back to his homeland his Marxist ideals, and on the long train journey through war-torn Europe, he wrote down his template for a socialist future.
He pronounces his 10 principles, like Moses coming down with the tablets, the 10 commandments, the April Theses, the 10 April Theses.
The April Theses essentially boil down to two things. One is all power to the Soviets, which means no confidence in the provisional government, and secondly, down with the imperialist war.
But he would have to convince his party, the Bolsheviks.
A lot of his lieutenants thought him to be crazy. He just came from Switzerland, he doesn't understand the Russian situation.
He had a very, very strong personality. He's one of those people who never appears to doubt himself. He always believes that whatever line he has is correct. And that's very powerful, that's very helpful. But if you're wrong, it's dangerous. And the problem with Lenin was that he could be as stubbornly wrong as he was brilliantly right on occasions.
Lenin's slogan was peace, bread, and land. And it was much more appealing than the provisional government's continuing commitment to the Great War against Germany. Soldiers had lost the will to fight a war that seemed increasingly pointless.
Russians wanted peace, but they didn't want to surrender their country to Germany. Soldiers, sailors, they had a complex attitude towards the war because they were the ones whose lives were on the line. And they said, we're going to be defensive. We're not going to go over the top, but if they attack us, we'll fight back.
This government, which has been there, since the Tsar was overthrown, suddenly declares an offensive at the front. It looks as though the government hasn't changed, and neither have its war aims.
In Petrograd, soldiers mutiny, determined not to be sent to the front. It ignites the biggest threat yet to the new government.
So what sparked it off is the attempt of the government to try to move troops out of Petrograd as part of this offensive. And the masses say, that's a line in the sand, we're not going to cross it, we're going to stop you from doing that.
They take to the streets, demanding that power be transferred to the Soviets. They appeal for support from the sailors in Kronstadt. The sailors respond immediately. At first light on the 4th of July, over 10,000 sailors meet in Anchor Square. They receive ammunition, board their ships, and head down the Gulf towards the capital. Their aim was simple: to overthrow the provisional government. The men of Kronstadt were fired up to protect the freedom they had gained, but had no real clue about how to do it. So they turned to the man who seemed destined to lead them.
Lenin devises a program which almost exactly matches what the Kronstadt sailors want. No support for the government, no support for the war. It's almost designed with sailors in mind. So there's almost a meeting of minds between, on the one hand, Lenin, on the other, the sailors.
Thousands of sailors disembarked in Petrograd and headed through the hot city streets, gathering many others on their way. By the time they got to the Bolshevik headquarters, at the Kashesinskaya mansion, they were eager to hear just one man.
They wanted to hear Lenin. The problem was Lenin first didn't want to address to them. He had no ideas what to say to them.
Lenin gives a few tub-thumping phrases about, yeah, it's great to see you, wonderful.
His confusing speech from the balcony lasted less than a minute.
Lenin doesn't trust spontaneous revolutions from below, doesn't trust spontaneous forces. He wants to have something which he's organized, which he's led, which he understands, which is under control, which is going in the right direction.
The frustrated sailors moved on into the city to meet with soldiers and other demonstrators, many still ready for a fight.
The problem is that nobody else is ready to lead them or to carry out that fight. There could easily have been a July revolution. Nobody could have saved the provisional government from the Kronstadters and from the demonstrations of July. They could have just walked in and arrested the provisional government, but they had nothing to put in its place.
The demonstration was to end tragically. In the heart of the city, provisional government troops fired on the protesters from the rooftops. The demonstration turned into a riot. There was looting, violence, and killing. The attempt by the sailors to bring down the government had backfired completely, and the Bolsheviks were now ruined.
The July days appears to be the radicals overstepping the mark. So the government cleverly begins to turn this to its own advantage by saying we have papers to prove that Lenin is being financed by the Germans.
Lenin is branded a German spy and a traitor to his homeland. orders are issued for his arrest.
Lenin himself immediately goes into hiding out of reach of the provisional government. But the Bolshevik party simply carries on semi-underground. But Lenin believes that they've lost the revolution.
The Bolsheviks are ruined. And in Petrograd, there is a new mood for tougher government. The former Minister of War, Alexander Kerensky, is appointed Prime Minister. But within weeks he is in trouble when his newly appointed Commander-in-Chief, General Kornilov, appeared to turn against Kerensky and sent troops towards the city. Suddenly, Kerensky needed to defend the capital, but as his government had lost the trust of the army, there was only one place he could turn to for help.
At the last minute, Kerensky decides to arm the Soviet, and the Soviet says, we're not going to work with you unless you release members of the Soviet who've been arrested. It meant that Kerensky was turning towards the Soviet.
But not a shot was fired. Soviet agitators stopped the troop train before it reached Petrograd. They confronted the soldiers with words, not bullets, and persuaded the soldiers not to fight. The army revolt was effectively over. But Kerensky's position was now fatally weakened. He had lost support from all sides. Worse still, having armed his opponents in the Petrograd Soviet, he could not take their weapons back from them.
The Bolsheviks are seen as new broom that will sweep Russia of all the old privileged elements and will bring about a workers' and peasants' republic.
But Lenin had missed this revival of fortunes. Back in July, he thought the revolution was finished. Now, on October the 7th, Lenin made the journey back into Russia from his hideaway in Finland, disguised as a railway fireman. He saw the time was ripe for the Bolsheviks to seize power. And with 40,000 Petrograd workers now armed, it was only a matter of time.
Lenin suddenly re-emerged on the 10th of October at a Central Committee meeting in a flat in the suburbs of Petrograd. A very dramatic occasion. The whole of the Petrograd Bolshevik establishment is there, and Lenin appears in the midst of his disciples, and he starts to try to get the party to think about seizing power. The Central Committee is not keen on the idea. They're thinking back to July. If we step out of line now, we're going to get kicked again. Lenin, with the power of his personality, his prestige in the party, the fact that he's the leader, gets a motion through which simply says, we are going to put armed uprising on the agenda.
At the end of the meeting, Lenin wrote on a scrap of paper torn from a child's notebook. An armed uprising is inevitable, and the time for it fully ripe. In the small hours, having made a decision which was to plunge the country into a second bloody revolution and change the whole course of Russia's history, they passed round the tea. The next day, the Bolsheviks had a stroke of luck. Many of their leaders who had been arrested after the July days were let out of jail.
The key figure for the Bolsheviks is Fyodor Raskolnikov. He's a very peculiar guy because he's a combination of a naval officer and a veteran Bolshevik. And Raskolnikov is in the radical wing. He doesn't like the provisional government. He doesn't like the war. He wants to push things forward as rapidly as possible.
Raskolnikov made his way to the Smolny Institute. It was a former school for young ladies, which had become home to the socialist parties of the Petrograd Soviet. It was the center of constant meetings and feverish activity. Lenin kept his distance from the Smolny. He and the Bolshevik Central Committee had decided that the only way to take power was by force.
Lenin is in favor of action. He needs all the force he can get in Petrograd to overthrow the old order. So he looks around for forces. Key force for that, once again, Kronstadt. Kronstadt can bring 10,000 men within a day into the heart of the city to do what the Bolshevik leadership wants.
But Lenin had to be careful how he phrased the request for help from the sailors. He knew they did not really want the same thing.
Now, because Lenin wants a Bolshevik government, that is not what the Kronstadt sailors want. They want a Soviet government, and that's the beginning of a split, of a potential, gap between Lenin and the sailors.
But for now, the sailors are prepared to back the Bolsheviks to defend the revolution and defend the Soviets. Any argument between them could come later. Over the next few days, the Bolsheviks formulated their plans to take over power, seizing railway stations, bridges, and telephone exchanges. This would be the real thing, not an impulsive, spontaneous upsurge of feeling, but a planned armed revolution. And the sailors of Kronstadt would be in the front line. In a telephone call from Petrograd late in the evening of the 24th of October, the Revolutionary Committee officially asked the sailors to come to the defense of the Soviets. The sailors are again quick to respond. They set about making detailed plans so as to leave nothing to chance.
Everyone seemed really determined. We were thinking more clearly than we had in July, and we knew exactly what we had to do.
The second revolution in October is different from the first revolution in February, and the main difference is it's a pre-planned revolution. It's organized in advance.
Early on the 25th of October, the sailors set off for the capital. The flotilla arrived in the afternoon and joined the cruiser Aurora in the river Neva in the center of Petrograd. Their orders were clear: to seize control of the Winter Palace where the Prime Minister and the Cabinet were meeting, and demand the surrender of the provisional government. This was the moment when the sailors from Kronstadt would finally sweep aside what was left of the old order. The sailors found their way into the palace through open doors, encountering little resistance. They ran through a maze of richly decorated rooms and corridors in one of the biggest and most richly decorated palaces in the world, searching for defending troops. But they had no plan of the building, and finding the provisional government ministers in one of the palace's 360 rooms proved to be no easy task. It was like a massive game of hide and seek. When they finally reached this dining room, they found Kerensky, the Prime Minister, had already left, and the ministers waiting to be arrested. It was the end of the provisional government. Only 2 miles away, at the Smolny Institute, delegates at the Second Congress of Soviets are locked in furious debate about the future direction of the revolution. They are completely unaware of how far things have already gone at the Winter Palace. The arguments were largely irrelevant, however, as Lenin was on his way with power over the country already in his hands.
The critical point is when Lenin goes down by tram across Petrograd to present that Congress with power and to declare all power to the Soviets. It's a very, very important coming together of Lenin's political leadership and the development of the revolution in Russia. He really sets Russia's fate by that one action.
But members of the other parties suspected that the Congress had been rigged. They felt that when Lenin said all power to the Soviets, he really meant all power to the Bolsheviks. The opposition parties staged a walkout, leaving Lenin and the Bolsheviks in complete control. By this one act, Lenin's rivals effectively consigned themselves to the dustbin of history. It was to be the beginning of a Bolshevik reign of power that would last for over 70 years. Now the Bolsheviks set about the business of changing Russia forever. Unexpectedly, one of the first major problems they had to deal with was the looting of the vintage wine from the palace's cellars. It was one of the biggest collections ever known, and thousands of bottles were drunk or given away to the people of the city. The streets filled with drunken mobs, and intoxicated sailors used well-dressed people for target practice. In Petrograd, the October Revolution was seen in with one of the biggest hangovers in history. Behind the scenes, Lenin tightened the reins of power. But the people pinned their hopes for the future on the promised Constituent Assembly, to be Russia's first fully democratically elected parliament.
The Constituent Assembly offered the promise of a democratic, fair, egalitarian future for Russia. It was to be her first fully, fairly, democratically elected government.
The Constituent Assembly was going to be elected by the whole country. It was going to establish a new system. It was going to establish democracy. They wanted to build a firm democratic framework that would establish what they had gained. And that's what got people very excited.
There was a huge effort in the countryside to educate the population, to teach them what was meant by democratic elections, and to ensure that proper democratic procedure was being carried out in the countryside. And this was remarkably successful given these incredibly difficult conditions in 1917.
The elections are held, but the results leave the Bolsheviks with only a quarter of the vote. This left them with little choice but to take drastic action.
Here above that box where we are, right here on the balcony, here were the invited guests. Basically they were Bolsheviks and Bolshevik sympathizers. When the other parties were speaking, they jeered, whistled, shouted and from time to time aimed rifles at the delegates. One person even fired a shot and very nearly killed someone.
Lenin had no time for democracy and showed his contempt for the assembly by laying down and dozing.
Lenin said that a democratic parliamentary republic was a step backwards and that a step forward was a republic of Soviets, the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was 4:30 in the morning when the security chief, a stony-faced sailor, approached the rostrum and announced, "The guard is tired. Please leave the hall."
Lenin had closed the assembly by forcing out the delegates, and it was the sailors from Kronstadt that had helped him. He had effectively taken control by force and killed any hope of universal democracy.
Lenin had never seen any reason to share power with any other political party. He believed that his way was the correct way, that the others were simply petty bourgeois intellectuals who were going to lead the revolution astray, so it had to be under his leadership.
Lenin set up an extraordinary commission to deal with what he saw as counter-revolution. Known simply as the Checker, it was the forerunner of the KGB and had the power to arrest, try, and execute anyone they saw as dangerous to the regime. Opposition groups are dealt with ruthlessly.
It's intended to be a legitimate revolutionary instrument for smiting the unjust, for smiting the counter-revolutionaries. Unfortunately, people are not like that. And it begins to attract all kinds of people, and it begins to get, to some extent, out of control.
The Checker took it upon themselves to root out all forms of criticism. In Moscow, the popular clown, Bim-Bom, who satirized the communists on stage, attracted their attention.
Мой друг пришел! Ха-ха! Дуэль! Раз, два... Стоять!
The sailors of Kronstadt now had grave doubts about the regime they had helped to install. They registered a protest against Lenin and the excesses of the Cheka. They believed they were exercising their democratic duty, but in fact, they were unknowingly plotting a collision course with Lenin. It was to be the beginning of their end. Over the next 3 years, they would fight in a brutal civil war to save their revolution, and come face to face with their former comrades in Lenin's Red Army. The Russian Revolution changed the world forever. Almost overnight, an entire society was destroyed and replaced with one of the most radical social experiments ever seen. Poverty, crime, privilege and class division were to be eliminated. A new era of socialism promised peace, prosperity, and equality for all the peoples of the world. But the social experiment failed. Millions were killed, and within a generation, almost 1/3 of the world's population was living in the shadow of communism. This story shows how an idealistic dream turned into a nightmare, as seen by the sailors at the vanguard of the revolution. Drawn from their letters and accounts, the story is told using archive and reconstructions of the events, all in color, just as they might have seen it. This is the story of the Russian Revolution. Less than 20 miles from St. Petersburg, in the Gulf of Finland, lays a small fortified island. It was built to defend the former capital of Russia against attack from the sea. Surrounded by a string of fortresses, it is still an active naval base, and until a few years ago, the island and its garrison town of Kronstadt remained closed to visitors. Only recently has the story of what happened here in the early years of the revolution been finally pieced together. At the beginning of 1917, the Russian emperor was forced to abdicate after bread shortages sparked a spontaneous revolution. The cause was taken up with a bloody enthusiasm by the sailors of Kronstadt. They grasped the idea of creating a new society of self-governing Soviet councils with passion.
People got new faith. They had a feeling of being the center of the world. The most important events are here, and it's up to us how to solve them. So we are masters of history to some extent.
But in October, the revolution was also taken up by Lenin's Bolshevik party, who with the help of the sailors forced their way to power. Now, the Bolsheviks fear their rivals. Determined to keep control, they have begun to build the apparatus of a police state. Slowly, a gap is growing between the party and the people, and the sailors from Kronstadt are caught in the middle.
Most of us were happy that we were defending the revolution, defending what we had gained. But underneath, we weren't sure.
On one hand, you have a party leadership which wants to build an entire new humanity, an entire new world, and you've got this mass popular revolution we've been looking at, which simply wants bread, peace, land, and all power to the Soviets. The leadership is out of conjuncture with the mass movement itself.
Lenin tells us that all the hardships are necessary to defend the revolution. Maybe that's true, but many heroes of the revolution have been thrown in jail. Many good friends have died. I don't know. The people didn't have freedom. This didn't seem like the revolution we had all fought for.
The more the coercion comes in, the less consent there's going to be. So they begin to get very early on into a kind of vicious spiral of losing a lot of the support they had initially in 1917.
As support for the party ebbed away, the Bolsheviks, now also known as communists, became increasingly paranoid. Yet they were right to be worried. On the 30th of August 1918, Lenin was visiting a factory on the outskirts of Moscow. Fanya Kapla, a woman working with a banned terrorist group, was standing in the crowd. She fired 3 shots directly at Lenin. 2 bullets entered his body. 1 pierced his lung, the other lodged in his neck. By the time he was brought back to the Kremlin, he appeared to be on the point of death. As crowds gathered outside, Lenin's paranoia continued. He refused all medical help until they could find a guaranteed Bolshevik doctor. Surprisingly, Lenin survived the shooting, and the party press declared his quick recovery as a miracle. They distributed pamphlets portraying Lenin as the chosen one. But the failed attempt on Lenin's life also unleashed a wave of terror against anyone considered counter-revolutionary. The Cheka, already a formidable body with the power to arrest, try, and execute, began to torment anyone thought to have incorrect beliefs or the wrong class origins.
There was not a single town which did not have its own Cheka. And these were organizations which combined arrest, investigation, trial, and execution. It was enough to open a telephone directory where there would be listed all the numbers and addresses of all, let's say, the Petrograd intelligentsia. Included in this definition of enemies there were Cossacks, priests, businessmen, practically all the thinking element of Russian society before the revolution.
Openly described as the Red Terror, it had become elevated to official policy. In Petrograd, the leading Bolshevik newspaper shrieked, "For the blood of Lenin, let there be floods of blood of the bourgeoisie, more blood, as much as possible." Since the failed assassination attempt on Lenin, the Bolsheviks have formalized the use of terror in order to stifle all opposition and keep a firm grip on power. Within a month, the Cheka had ordered the deaths of 800 left-wing rivals of the regime. Lenin feared a counter-revolution more than anything else, and by the end of the year, over 6,000 political opponents are murdered. Lenin also feared a military threat. Russia was still fighting Germany in the First World War, and Lenin's attempts to get peace by pulling out of the war had failed. Fearing a renewed attack from the Germans, he created a new fighting force, the Red Army. Its leader was Lenin's second-in-command, Lev Davidovich Bronstein. His party name was Leon Trotsky. But their peace overtures to Germany unwittingly created a threat from a completely different direction.
The government in Moscow is worried about mainly the Germans, and they think there's going to be an attack from the West. So when they begin creating a Red Army, it's to fight the Germans. It's to be there in the West. And in fact, the danger suddenly emerges in May, June, July of 1918 in the East.
In the East, a Czech Legion that had been recruited to fight with the Russians rebelled.
The Czechs rebel in the end because they think that the Soviet government is in league with the Germans, because they think that they will be handed over to the Germans, from which army they are deserters. And so they're desperate not to be caught in that situation.
When Trotsky ordered them to disarm, they refused and took over control of the Trans-Siberian Railway and large chunks of Siberia.
Things escalate into a serious crisis, and local Russian forces, local anti-Bolshevik Russian forces, are able to exploit that to create a center for counter-revolution.
The rebel army quickly grew to over 40,000 men and moved west. In their path is the city of Ekaterinburg, where the royal family have been under house arrest for 4 months. With the clear danger that the family might end up in enemy hands, the local Cheka are ordered to prevent them becoming a focus for dissent. On the 16th of July, 1918, they are told to assemble in a storeroom, from where they will be taken somewhere safe.
Please.
When Tsarist family was killed, there was no huge popular response, wave of indignation, no. Not much response, not much. People had seen a lot of killed women and kids at this time.
After 300 years, the Romanov dynasty is ended. The Czechs and the growing rebel army continue their advance into the Russian heartland. Standing in their way is the mighty river Volga. The key crossing point is at the city of Kazan. The city falls to the rebels, and the Bolsheviks realize the size and danger of this new threat. Almost by accident, an army had been created around the Czech Legion, determined to remove the Bolsheviks from power. The counter-revolution they had feared was underway. Elsewhere, others also start to rebel. To distinguish them from the Red Revolutionaries, they were later labeled Whites.
The fighting starts in the center of Russia. There's a real power vacuum. It becomes important once again to send forces from the big cities.
With the Red Army largely occupied with the fight against the Germans, the government call on their most loyal troops to save the emerging crisis. The sailors from Kronstadt. The sailors had been at the forefront of Lenin's October Revolution and had a tough reputation as his most feared shock troops.
People are afraid of the sailors. When you have rebellion somewhere in South Russia, what do? You send the sailors.
the sailors traveled by train from Kronstadt and then sailed the last 200 miles down the river Volga. Leading the fleet was the Bolshevik Raskolnikov. As the flotilla approached Kazan, they planned their attack.
The sailors have a kind of esprit de corps, which is unlike most other forces in Russia. The sailors are there, they're radical, and they're prepared to fight as a unit.
Bolshevik forces attacked from hills above the town, while soldiers and sailors launched their assault from ships on the river. But the battle is fierce, and after days of fighting, progress is still slow. This is the crunch point. If they can't retake the town, the Bolsheviks are almost certain to lose their grip on the entire country. The Bolsheviks now had nothing left to throw into the battle but persuasion.
We were running low on food and equipment. We were taking a lot of casualties and they were shooting deserters. But the Bolsheviks didn't bring bullets, they sent agitators. Larissa Reisner had impressed us with her poetry back in 1917. Now she was a party commissar. Sure, we were having doubts about the party, but in the end, we couldn't really have any doubts about fighting.
For the Kronstadt sailors, the situation was a very, very clear-cut one. Either they put all their energies into defending the Reds and fighting for the Red cause, or else the Whites would be victorious.
Eventually, Trotsky and the other agitators helped their troops turn the battle. Kazan was back in Bolshevik hands. The first successful counterattack for the Reds on the Eastern Front. But when the Bolsheviks entered Kazan, it became apparent just how brutal the fight with the Whites was going to be. The mutilated bodies of Bolshevik supporters were found in shallow graves, or left lying in the streets and alleys, some with their eyes poked out, party cards pinned to their chests. The Battle of Kazan had been hard fought, but the Bolsheviks had turned the tide at the Volga, and the sailors from Kronstadt had yet again been at the vanguard.
The Kronstadt sailors had shown extraordinary bravery and determination in fighting a very, very bitter struggle, one that at times could have gone against the Bolsheviks. And this confirmed the Bolshevik leadership's view that the Kronstadt sailors were the most resolute and reliable defenders of the Red cause.
Trotsky and the Kronstadt sailors moved back onto the river, chasing the retreating rebels. On board one of the ships, the Kazan, Larissa Reisner was exploring her new position as commissar and wife of Raskolnikov. The Bolshevik she had met in the heady days after the revolution was now commander of the Baltic fleet. The Kazan had previously belonged to the recently murdered royal family. Now it belonged to the party and was being used as a staff ship. While on board, she noticed that the former Tsarina, Alexandra, had scratched her name in one of the windows of the dining room. she replaced it with her own. A few months later, on the 11th of November 1918, the war with Germany ended. At last, Europe seemed to be at peace. But for Russia, there was no end to death and killing. The country had exploded into a massive civil war that was to cause more deaths in Russia than all the bloody years of the First World War. The Civil War had grown into a power struggle between the Bolshevik Reds and conservative white generals. These men wanted to return to imperialist rule, to life before the revolution.
Because they're really basically, it's the old order trying to regain power with making very, very few social concessions.
Unlike the trench war with the Germans in the West, the Civil War was fast-moving. Troops covered thousands of miles of land on armored trains and swept across the countryside on horseback. While the Reds struggled in the war against Germany, the Whites had the advantage. Hurriedly, the government moved the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, as the area controlled by the Bolsheviks shrank to not much more than the core of European Russia. The Whites also had the support of the newly victorious European powers. They saw Lenin's worldwide communist mission as a clear threat to the capitalist world. Britain, France, America, and Japan together sent 200,000 troops to help supply the Whites and strangle any Bolshevik expansion by keeping them busy at home.
With the collapse of Germany, all of a sudden, intervention, or at least support for the Whites, becomes a much more serious possibility. You've got a whole new theater of operations. Because the Germans have lost, the Baltic Sea is now open, the Black Sea is now open, Turkey also is pulled out of the war, and because of that, the Allies can now move forces into central Russia.
The biggest country in the world now finds itself under a virtual blockade. British troops occupy the ports of Murmansk and Archangel in the north and advance hundreds of miles inland. Japan and Britain move into Siberia from Vladivostok in the east, where they are joined by troops from the United States. France supports the generals in the south from their base on the Black Sea coast. Russia is now surrounded by its former allies, and Lenin's paranoia proves justifiable. The whole world really was against them. The different white armies strike again and again at the Reds from almost every direction. But the Red Army is able to respond to each attack in turn. And when Petrograd is threatened with invasion from the White General Yudenich, the sailors from Kronstadt are again dispatched. Again, the Whites are defeated. Despite their foreign support, the White armies remain separated by huge distances. Their supplies are poor, and they are unable to coordinate their attacks. Slowly, the White generals realize that while the Reds maintain control of Russia's industrial heartland, they could never succeed. After 2 years, the last White general is defeated, and the Allies leave Russia for good. But the Civil War brutalized life in Russia to an unimaginable degree. Around 3 million Soviet and enemy troops were killed in action. Another 2 million died of disease. The people of Russia suffered just as much. To feed the urban workers and maintain war production, peasants were forced to hand over their grain surpluses at prices determined by the state. Those who resisted were shot, and whole villages were wiped out if they failed to hand over their grain to the checker. In the worst cases, they also removed the seed grain the peasants needed for planting the following year. At a time of rebellion and drought, this desperate policy led to a further 5 million deaths.
It worked. In a sense, it worked. It was economy for the war. Civil war is a crazy situation, so we are supposed to have a crazy economy to get the victory in the civil war. Like Trotsky put it, he put it in this way. We got victory in this civil war. The price was we ruined the country.
The civil war was over. The white generals had been defeated and the foreign powers had sailed away. But the desperate policies of the Bolshevik government had brought the country to its knees. Many of the Kronstadt sailors were from peasant families, and the letters they received from home made very bad reading.
Well, right the way through the summer and autumn of 1920, sailors are going back and forth. There's a lot of connection with the countryside and the towns. So and people are getting letters from home as well. They know how bad things are.
But not everyone was suffering. Some of the party elite were beginning to conspicuously enjoy the privileges of power. By the end of 1920, Raskolnikov and Reisner lived a comfortable life in Kronstadt, complete with full staff. When not at home, they made full use of the flagship, Krechet, and they held regular reception parties. It seemed as if the revolution had never happened, and they became deeply unpopular with the sailors.
They'd seen over the Civil War their direct democracy, their active democracy of 1917, being replaced by commissars, by people appointed above them, banning of their daily meetings, control of their Soviets. And they'd been, to an extent, prepared to put up with that for the Civil War period when there was a threat from the whites. But as the Civil War receded, they began to say, come on, now's the time to fulfill your promises. You said you were going to establish Soviet democracy. Where is it?
The letters we received from home were not good. Even the strongest supporters of the revolution had trouble defending what happened to the peasants and the people in the cities. When I thought back to all that had happened and that we had helped this come about, I felt sick. It seemed the only communists we saw were now lording it over us. And if the leaders like Lenin were allowing this, then the Bolshevik program which we had fought for in 1917 must have changed. We thought we'd been duped by liars and cheats.
Far from delivering a socialist utopia, the Bolsheviks now presided over a society close to collapse.
That winter is really a terrible time for Russia. Terrible hardship, terrible food shortages. The factories are closing down. The cities are already frozen. There's been massive depopulation of the cities when people go back to the countrysides.
Industrial production for Russia was only 20%, maybe even less, of what it had been in 1913, the last year of peace. Transport wasn't working, epidemics were endemic, there were all sorts of social problems, and people were not seeing solutions emerging to these things.
Petrograd was hit by severe strikes. In many rural areas there were regular peasant uprisings, usually against grain requisitioning.
Many of those workers not on strike could only be kept at their machines by gunpoint. Eventually, stories of what was happening in Petrograd reached the sailors at Kronstadt.
Something big is happening in the big city. They don't know what's happening. And the sailors sent delegation into Petrograd to ask the workers what's going on. And they get the impression that things are really very bad.
The Kronstadt sailors thought about Soviets as power to the people, as decentralizing power to the very, very lowest level. And what they saw as they looked around after 3 years of the most hideous civil war was not just a highly centralized one-party state, but also Soviets that no longer could in any sense claim to be genuine representatives of ordinary people.
In Kronstadt, support for the Bolsheviks dwindled. By early 1921, over 5,000 sailors, formerly the strongest supporters of the party, had resigned or destroyed their party cards. The sailors in the ships at Kronstadt became increasingly agitated at the situation in Petrograd and interference from the Communist Party.
What they want is really a return to some of the basic principles of the revolution.
They denounced the Cheka, they denounced the secret police, they denounced the erosion of democracy.
They want to free political prisoners, they want the possibility of free speech.
At a series of meetings, the sailors set out a list of demands aimed at reinstating what they thought they had won 4 years earlier.
They wanted a system whereby what the dream of 1917 of a multi-party Soviet democracy should take over.
This was a direct challenge to the rule of the party. In essence, what they wanted were free elections and an end to the Bolshevik dictatorship.
When the Kronstadt rebels take the slogans of 1917 and turn them against the Bolsheviks and say, what's happened to power to the Soviets? What's happened to equality? What's happened to all your promises to destroy privilege? Again, something that's re-emerged in the course of the Civil War. Then this is something that is deeply embarrassing to the Bolsheviks.
The fleet commander, Raskolnikov, had also become an embarrassment to the party. He and Larissa Reisner are told to leave Kronstadt and their privileged lifestyle behind. He had lost the sailors' respect and had clearly failed to keep them in check. Now, they sent in the big guns.
Lenin, who is the head of state and kind of the agitator-in-chief for the Soviet state, goes out to Kronstadt, addresses a very big meeting, and they lose control. And from that point, the crisis worsens.
The failure of Kalinin to win over the sailors merely strengthened their position. They formed a provisional revolutionary committee and elected one of the sailors as leader.
The leadership emerges, it just kind of comes from below. The key figure is a guy called Petrichenko. He'd been in the Navy since the time of the First World War, so he's there right the way through the whole time. He's not a Bolshevik, but he's what the Russians call a kind of accidental figure. And he's elected to be head of this provisional revolutionary committee.
Petrichenko's new committee drafted a message to be sent throughout Kronstadt. The Communist Party has been removed from power, and a temporary revolutionary committee is in control. We ask you to take control into your hands and closely observe communists and their actions. It was effectively a declaration of independence.
We knew we would have to fight, but we were free again, and perhaps, just perhaps, we could start the revolution once more.
They called their uprising the third revolution. February Revolution was the first one, October is the second one, and the Kronstadt is the third one.
Well, the Kronstadt sailors hoped that what they were doing was regenerating the forces of 1917. There's no longer an excuse for not implementing those ideals. The whites have been destroyed, they've been blown away. There's no direct threat to the revolution. We should be returning to what we thought we'd already got in 1917.
Lenin's response to the demands from Kronstadt was clear-cut.
It's zero tolerance for any other parties, zero tolerance for, the kind of democratic situation, which is what the Kronstadt sailors are asking for.
And the great fear of the Bolsheviks was that if concessions were made to the Kronstadt rebels, this would be a green light to all other malcontents to press for their demands too.
The sailors knew that it was only a matter of time before the Red Army would attack. It was still winter. The sea around the island was frozen solid. It could be stormed by foot soldiers. But as local historian Vitaly Pirogov shows, its defenses were strong.
The forts had been very powerfully fortified. There was barbed wire on the ice, minefields, there were mines specially located on the ice. This is very powerful fort. In places the concrete is 2-3 meters thick with granite, concrete and armor plating. All the guns are surrounded by armor plating. It's a very large and powerful armory.
Not only were the fortifications strong, the sailors of Kronstadt were renowned throughout Russia as crack troops.
They had been heroes of the revolution. They'd been the backbone of the revolution. They were symbolic of 1917.
This is what Trotsky calls the pride and glory of the revolution. It's the sense that the people who should be the greatest advocates of the revolution are suddenly turning their backs on the revolution.
The Red Army units in Petrograd were inexperienced and poorly suited to taking on the famous heroes of Kronstadt. Trotsky arrived in person to add steel to the attack. He was under no illusion that the Kronstadt rebellion posed a massive threat to the whole Bolshevik cause. The Red Army soldiers were forced to march out and take positions along the coastline. On March the 8th, they lined up to launch an attack across the sea ice.
From here, from this bridgehead, columns of storming troops set off on foot towards this powerful, battle-ready fortress.
You have troops on skis, you have troops going through heavy ice trying to work their way forward. The Reds have brought up heavy artillery to support the attack. There are guns in the main Kronstadt forts to fire back. The Reds drag machine guns out across the ice.
The Red Army hoped that smoke might disguise their attack, but it had little effect. They had nowhere to find cover on the open ice, and they met with fierce fire from the fortresses. The Red Army didn't stand a chance. In the end, 80% of the men who set out onto the ice died on the ice. The Kronstadt sailors had successfully repelled the Red Army. The fortress island had stood firm. But they were isolated. so they needed to get the people in mainland Russia behind them. After over 6 years of war, revolution, and hunger, the people did not have the strength to take part in another rebellion.
Majority of population of this country just wanted to survive. Just wanted to survive.
Lenin had a plan to keep the people on his side.
Bread supplies were brought in to Moscow and to Petrograd to try and quell some of the worker discontent.
And to ensure victory, the Bolsheviks did everything possible to discredit the heroes of 1917. They claimed that the sailors were full-blooded counter-revolutionaries working on the orders of the white generals. But crucially, the Red Army was running out of time.
The thaw will begin in late March, and when the thaw comes, it won't be possible to attack the island anymore. The government has to attack as soon as possible to prevent the island becoming really an invulnerable fortress.
"45,000 Red Army men were transferred to Petrograd. This time they were better equipped, wore winter camouflage, and there were twice as many of them. Once again, the sailors had to man their defenses and wait for the attack. It came at night.
The second attack is pushed against heavy resistance. The fighting is very bitter because no quarter is given. So either you flee or you are shot by the attacking Reds. It's a very, very vicious battle.
The battle lasted through the night and into the next day. But eventually, the Red Army entered the streets of Kronstadt. Scattered sailors make a desperate last stand. But the battle is lost. By 9 p.m. on the 17th of March, the crews of the two biggest battleships, Petropavlovsk and Sevastopol, finally surrender. The rebel cause was lost. Petrichenko, their leader, had already driven off to Finland in a car early that morning.
It was unlikely that they could ever have succeeded, unless they'd succeeded in persuading Lenin that that was the way forward, which is most improbable.
As it became clear that the battle was over, the sailors on the Petropavlovsk argued about what to do. Some wanted to blow up the ship. Others wanted to make a run for Finland.
Eventually, it was decided that those of us that felt guilty should head for Finland. Those that felt in the right should stay. It wasn't easy, but I decided to go.
The last few sailors that had not already run head for the ice and for Finland, some 8 miles away. Those who decided to stay handed in weapons, cleaned the ship, and calmly waited for what was going to happen next. By dawn the next day, the last stragglers were making their way across the ice, with the Red Army not far behind.
There are bodies all over the ice, and some of those bodies aren't recovered for weeks and weeks after the fighting.
The streets of Kronstadt were also littered with dead bodies.
Пошли! Пошли быстрее!
In the fortresses, the fighting had been brutal. The sailors that didn't escape were either shot or taken to one of Russia's first concentration camps. The Kronstadt rebellion was the last major battle for the soul of Russia. Thousands had died in the fighting, but the killing was to continue. One man has pinpointed the place where many were killed. It was here in this wood, just outside St. Petersburg, where some of the Kronstadt sailors took their last steps.
This road was the last path which separated people from this world and the next. This, of course, is a really awful place. It's awful because till this very day, nobody really knows exactly how many people are lying here. Various figures have been bandied about, on average between 12 to 15,000 people. Now, of course, the bottom of the ravine has risen, but in those days, 85 years ago, it was a deep pit. Witnesses say that those condemned to death dug their own graves before they were shot. While people were waiting their turn, they made fires so they could warm themselves, and they waited there until their turn to depart into non-being, into nothingness. Here they shot not only the Kronstadt sailors, here they shot the flower of the Petrograd elite, all the people who were the pride and glory of Russia's history.
Да здравствует народная революция!
Around 8,000 men from Kronstadt made it across the ice to the relative safety of Finland. But the last glimmer of the utopian dream, a world of equality and respect without poverty, crime and privilege, was left behind on the island.
What really died at Kronstadt in 1921 was the aspirations of 1917, the popular movement, the mass movement. It was the last spark of the greatest social upheaval, the greatest popular revolution the world has ever seen.